Geek Patrol are the who's who when it comes to the geek universe.
They're in the Geek Tank.
Okay, it's that time of the month. Our good buddy Jeremy Veldman from the Memphis Astronomical Society is here, and I'm shooting daggers at him right now, people, because normally Jeremy gives me some show notes. He kind of tells us what to, he prepares us. Well, he just walked in today with Bill Weppner, who is actually an Apollo legend.
Hero!
You guys know Apollo 13. We've all seen the movie Apollo 13, which is one of the high points of our space programs, because they took a bad situation and saved the astronauts. And Bill is here. He was part of that mission. Thanks, Jeremy. Good to see you, man.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for having me again.
You got some intelligent questions and some, preparation. But
why would we start now?
You're carrying this discussion, sir.
Well, you guys are in the presence of greatness this morning.
Yeah.
Bill, it's good to see you. Welcome to Geek Tank.
It's very nice to be here. Good morning, all of you.
Yeah, wait about 15 minutes and see how you feel. Anyway. All right, well, hey, Jeremy, introduce our audience to Bill, please.
Well, the Apollo, of course, we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the historic Apollo moon landings, and we got somebody here this morning that goes beyond any Ryan Gosling or Ron Howard film.
He's better!
This is an individual who was there and he lived it himself. I bring to you a former NASA flight controller from 1968 to 1970, associate professor of mathematics, and retired U.S. Air Force. I'm done with it. Here he is, Mr. Bill Weppner. He was there when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin took their one giant leap for mankind. Yeah. He was there for the successful failure of the Apollo 13 mission. And, of course, he's going to talk about his favorite Apollo mission. So, Bill, take us down this road.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much again for having me, and good morning to you all. And I can give you a little bit of background about my experiences on the Apollo program, but perhaps we can do a Q&A and you can shoot me some questions and we can do it that way.
Any questions?
How do the astronauts go to the bathroom? No.
Well, I have an answer to that also. In fact, the first time I gave this talk, it was to some sixth graders at Woodland Presbyterian School, and that was about the second or third question that I got. And my answer.
I kind of love what you're dealing with here, Bill.
And my answer was very, very carefully. And that said, if you Google how do the astronauts go to the bathroom, there was about a 4 or 5 minute video that a young lady does, and it's very well done and it's very tasteful, so I recommend that.
Tastefully executed. Okay. Yeah. Well, hey, Bill, of course, you were from Apollo 7. Now, the first manned missions, because weren't they initially, I'm trying to remember, when was the first one where they sent people up and actually landed on the moon?
That was Apollo 11.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yes.
So 7, what were they doing between 7 and 11?
Well, let me back up, if I can, a few years. It's the whole space program, manned space program started with a single astronaut in a spacecraft called Mercury. And that was just to prove that we could launch successfully and put a human in space, and of course, just as importantly, recover him. And then Gemini was the follow-on to Mercury, and that was a two-man spacecraft, and that had many objectives, rendezvous and docking, and prolonged exposure to spaceflight. The longest Gemini mission was 2 weeks. So they had to learn how to go to the bathroom. And then, of course, the ultimate goal was to land on the moon, and that was done with a 3-man spacecraft, which was Apollo. And the first Apollo launch, there were a couple of unmanned launches to check out the huge Saturn V booster and the spacecraft itself. And but the first manned launch was 50 years ago this month of October.
Oh, that's right.
And that was orbital.
Okay.
And
the orbit.
And that was about a 6-day orbital mission and then recovered. I forget exactly the length, but it was mainly to test, to shake out the spacecraft and then to land and recover it and make sure that that mission, the concepts and the objectives were met, and they were met very successfully. Now, following that, the planned mission that was Apollo 7. Apollo 8 originally was to be a orbital mission with the second spacecraft, the lunar lander, but that wasn't ready. That was still in on the assembly line, as you will, and Grumman Aircraft, the contractor for the lunar lander, they had not finished completely the assembly of the lunar missions. So the objectives of Apollo 8 were changed, and the goal was to go to the moon and orbit the moon. Right. And that's what was accomplished with Apollo 8, and we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of that, and that's this coming December, and it was at Christmas time.
Yeah.
Christmas Day.
Hey, Bill, I had a question because we all know that famous speech by President Kennedy about how we're going to land somebody on the moon before the decade's out, and how I'm curious, and then especially after he was assassinated. How much did that weigh on everybody? I mean, was there this genuine sense of urgency? Because, I mean, there's only so much you can do. I mean, you can't force all this progress and everything. But it's still amazing that you even did it in 10 years. I mean, honestly. But
I never cease to be amazed, and it's been 50 years since I was a participant in the program, and I still wonder how in the world we as a society and as a country pulled it off. But yes, because the very first Mercury mission was with Alan Shepard, and that didn't even go into orbit. It was just up and down a parabolic path, and a mere 3 weeks after that was when President Kennedy made his famous speech to Congress, May 25th of 1961, and he committed the country to the lunar landing by the end of that century. And everybody got on board. It was a national objective.
Yeah.
Very, very well funded. Congress was 100% behind it. And also, we were back then in competition with the then Soviet Union. Sure. And they also had a space program. And so we were really trying to fulfill two goals: satisfy President Kennedy's challenge, and also be first to the moon ahead of the Soviets.
Bill, I got a couple questions for you.
Yes.
One's a two-parter kind of thing. One, in your opinion, what's the likelihood of us landing then on Mars in the next decade, some odd?
I would say the chances are very slim for a lot of reasons. Funding for one, national interest for another.
You don't think the interest is there? I mean, amongst the
scientists and the NASA community, of course, but it takes Congress to be behind it and to fund it, because it would be a hugely expensive mission. And also, I feel, what are the payoffs for a mission to Mars involving that much risk to the humans, plus that much time and space? It's a tremendously long coast time between Earth and Mars.
Well, that being said, though, we have the new Falcons, right? The Elon Musk Falcon, rocket propulsions, and all that other good stuff, which could shorten some of that trip load, right?
Well, I'm going to not comment on that too much, but I will say, if you see the very last slide of my presentation, my basic question is, what next?
Yeah.
And where will it be?
Right.
And Mars is one of the possibilities. Yeah. But I think, personally, you ask my personal opinion, I think the nearer term goals would be more achievable and maybe more bang for the buck, either near Earth orbit or the moon. And then we can talk about what would be our objectives if we did go back to the moon. Colonization, industrialization. Now we're getting into multi-country competition.
Right.
Are we going to be established countries in areas of the moon?
Right.
It's a loaded question that takes a lot of thought.
Martian, nationality, if you will.
Yeah.
Almost,
well,
Well, you're creeping it. Yeah, we talk about that all the time, Bill.
Yeah.
We're like, we're waiting for the Space Force, all
Space
the other
Force.
stuff, and it's like, who knows? But
Do you have a thing against Stanley Kubrick?
no, I do not.
I'm just throwing it out there. It's a question. It's a valid question. They say that it's fake. The whole thing was fake. It's impossible to fake it, though, right?
oh yeah,
It's the elephant in the room. You have to talk about it, Joe.
I think that's such a stupid concept that they faked it. But does that bug you? Do people ever?
It's got to bother you.
I got to tell you, I was in a conversation with somebody a few months ago, and somehow the subject of the Apollo moon landings came up.
Yeah.
And it almost floored me to get this question. And fairly intelligent individual. That's not it. But he said, "Do you really think we went?" It happened during the Nixon administration. Of course, there's all this intrigues surrounding the Nixon administration because of how it ended with Watergate. And I'm thinking, are we getting to a point now where we have a generation of individuals that grows up thinking, since we didn't go to the moon in my lifetime, are we so narcissistic as a society now where if it didn't happen when I was born or when I was alive, maybe it never happened and the whole thing was a hoax?
Dude, we have flat earthers.
I have no words for that other than to say this is one of the greatest moments in the history of humanity, and also one of the greatest moments in the history of our democracy, where we had a sitting president challenge us to achieve an almost impossible goal by the time that decade was over, galvanized our country, rallied, and men like Bill Weppner made this happen. We got this done.
Amen. That's right. No, it's true. Absolutely. That's the whole thing. I mean, as
ready for
battle. What a great thing it was for America too. Like you say, people put aside political.
When you get back to
differences,
Kennedy's speech in 1961, he was one of the reasons why he set this goal is because there was this battle going on between communism and democracy. Which one is going to prevail? At the height of its influence, over 1 billion people were under the influence of communism, and it was spreading into the third world at that time. They had just launched Sputnik only 4 years earlier. If you were alive back then and you watched Sputnik go overhead, you're thinking, oh my God, they're going to put a nuclear missile on this thing. They're going to conquer us in space.
Bill, is that what it's going to take, though?
Burying us and everything.
Bill, is that what it's going to take?
Those opinions and fears were definitely drivers of the program.
We kind of have that now. We have those fears still now today. Is it going to take somebody sitting in front of Congress and inside the hall going, we need to get to the Mars?
I think yes. And now I'll ask you a question. Who is it going to be?
Me. I'm going to stand up there and go, hey, look, we're going to Mars, guys. Let's go. Pack it back.
Let me just say...
He's like Luthor.
Elon Musk.
I think it's going to take somebody with political stature.
Yeah.
You don't think Elon would run and be all
Well, that's...
Yeah.
Not in my lifetime.
Not to start this conversation, Brody, but I don't see the same urgency of going to the moon and like you said with Sputnik and everything in our rush
But Bill brought up a good point.
I don't know that it's the same thing.
Colonization of the moon.
Who wants to go to? I mean, I'm not living on the moon. Do you want to go live there?
Hell yeah!
I'd like to go do
totally sending you,
dude. You would totally send some people to the moon. You would love to send me to the moon.
But I'm not living there. What do
you would love to send me to the moon.
I mean,
I saw a video on YouTube with Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, and he had some interesting thoughts about if we do return to the moon, what the objectives would be. And he feels that the Earth, we're running out of green space for people, for inhabitation of the Earth. So let's take our industry and our distribution centers and our manufacturing and put them on the moon.
He would say that. He'd be like, we're going to turn it into a giant warehouse.
Okay.
Can you imagine how much Prime will cost then?
Right. Right.
Okay, so factory workers don't have it bad enough. Now they got to go live with weird gravity and no oxygen.
We're gonna,
and
although they lose 10, 20 pounds right off the bat.
Before we can send them though, we've got to send our contractors up there to build stuff.
Yeah,
Joe.
So I'm not going.
Joe, bye, Joe.
All right. Well,
imagine the pay, Joe.
But, you know,
You'll be able to fund 5 conventions.
Yeah.
Bill and I were discussing this last night. They were essentially making it up as they were going. I mean, there were no regulations. There were no there were no pamphlets. There were no books. I mean, there was no indication necessarily that this was even going to be a success. They were just kind of winging it as they were going and pulled it off.
Yeah, and I've heard interviews with like Neil Armstrong and others, and all they said confidentially, none of them thought they'd actually even live through this. They all expected at any moment they could die, right? I mean, so these are real heroes.
Yes, they are heroes, but their backgrounds, especially the early astronauts, before we got into recruiting scientific astronauts, these guys were. It was nothing for them to land on a moving aircraft carrier, pitching in the middle of an ocean at night.
Right. Yeah.
This is child's play compared to that. So yes, they were all combat. Seasoned veterans. A lot of them had flown in Korea, and so they knew how to evaluate risks. And of course, this was pushing the envelope. And these most of these astronauts were also test pilots, and that's what test pilots do.
Yeah, I mean, test pilot right there. That sounds about the most dangerous job. And aviation is still pretty new back at this era in the 60s.
Of course, yes.
A lot of experimental aircraft.
Do you look back in those rooms like you were in your big giant control panels and things like that, right? I mean, most of that stuff now we can fit like on an iPad.
Yes.
You know? I mean, it's in your pocket pretty much. Do you look back now and go, why haven't we, leaps and bounds above where we were before? You know, does that kind of like, I don't want to say like annoy you, but does it make you call into question like, what are we doing?
Well, you compare the computers of 50 years ago with what we have today, and that's one of the topics I addressed briefly in my slideshow. Yes, the pocket iPhone has a lot more computing capability than the Apollo computer, but the Apollo computer was designed to do one thing, and it did it very, very well. Compare that to the P-51 Mustang. There is no way that the P-51 Mustang could compare with the high-performance Navy aerobatic planes of today, but the Mustang was designed to do one thing, and what was that? To accompany our bombers all the way into the targets and back.
Speaking of the P-51
and they did
Mustang,
that very well.
Yeah.
Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe in Germany during World War II, when he saw the P-51 Mustang, he commented, "The game is up." In other words, the war is over. We're going to lose the war. That was one of the aircraft. That was one of the aircraft that the U.S. built that defeated Nazi Germany.
Isn't that something?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's a tremendous amount of pride. If for people who were alive in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, they set the stage for the life that we now live.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
We would not be where we are today without them.
Off of it.
Yeah.
I mean, we're still living off that pride.
That's why adults can sit on their couch and play Pokemon and not have to worry about some.
You don't sit on your couch to play, Joe.
Well, whatever, and it's like so. Yeah, we have a lot. We owe a lot of thanks to Bill's generation.
But before we get to the promo, I want one other thing here. So we had a setback. I say we. The men who worked on the Apollo missions had a setback with Apollo 1. It was a tragic accident where 3 astronauts burned alive. Just a terrible situation. Then you fast forward to Apollo 8, and I want Bill to comment briefly on Apollo 8 because we're coming up on the 50th anniversary. And it was the first time that a man-made vehicle left low Earth altitude orbit. And you talk about taking a tremendous risk to go and basically be ensnared by the gravity of another heavenly body. Apollo 8, Bill, talk about that.
Well, as I said earlier in our discussion, the Apollo 8 mission objectives originally were to be in low Earth orbit with the lunar module. Well, after that was changed, when we started rehearsing for the Apollo 8 mission, it was, believe me, the day after the splashdown of Apollo 7. So that was in the latter part of October, and we flew Apollo 8 2 months later. So we practiced and rehearsed and simulated all aspects of the Apollo 8 mission. We did not begin practicing that until the middle of October. Yes.
That's what I'm saying. Like,
now,
champagne was popped at the landing of that one, huh?
Well, a lot of American flags were flown.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of cigars were lighted. But so So what were the objectives? We were leaving Earth orbit for the very first time ever by humans. And we had done it unmanned, but we had never done it with humans. And then we didn't know whether there was going to be any impact from the Van Allen radiation belt. We didn't know whether we could get into lunar orbit or not. We had a brand new engine we had never tried before. So all these, from the time we left Earth orbit, everything else was new. We had never re-entered and recovered the spacecraft from deep space. It was always with a retrofire burn to take us out of Earth orbit. This time the burn wasn't necessary. We were coming home once we left lunar orbit and came in. We had no choice. We were going to enter the Earth's atmosphere, and can we do it accurately?
Yeah.
And all those objectives were achieved beautifully. As I recommend one book called Apollo 8 by Jeff Klugman. Kluger, I believe, is the way he spells his last name, and he's got a paragraph where he says, when we got into lunar orbit, our objective was to go into orbit, but if the rocket engine to slow us down to go into lunar orbit failed, well, then we just go around the moon and come back home. If we overburned, we were going to crash. Hopefully, and of course, as it turned out, we successfully burned the engine to slow us down enough to go into lunar orbit successfully. But regardless of those three scenarios, one thing was going to occur. Humans were going to see the backside of the moon for the very first time ever. Right. Nobody knew what the backside of the moon looked like.
There's a bunch of aliens back there.
My dad was a senior in college, graduating in 1968 when this happened.
Now you're making me feel old.
I'm getting old, but he recalls when the moment when those astronauts started to descend upon the dark side of the moon. Basically, there's a blackout, and in the control room, there's nothing you can do. You just wait and hope that they come out.
Guys!
Yeah.
So
and also
you'd be the guy they slap, Brody.
Yeah, I'd be like, uh-oh.
when you're orbiting over the moon, how far, like how many miles from the surface are they? I'm kind of curious about that. Like how close do they get?
About 60 miles. And then, they go into elliptical orbit, and then they circularize, and then before they actually land, they go into what is called a descent orbit initiation, where they go into a highly elliptical orbit, but the perigee is very close to the moon, say 50,000 feet, and then from there they do the descent orbit burn.
Because I was at observing last week, I guess, and Jeremy, you weren't there. I was. Whatever. We'll discuss that later. But they had they had a telescope set up that was really zeroed in, and it's really stunning when you look at the detail. But I can't imagine what the moon looks like from 60 miles away.
Could you imagine that flyby? If you were standing on the moon, that'd be.
I mean, that's gotta be So,
I'm getting chill bumps remembering the live TV of all this, because being there in Houston, right there were live feeds and everything, and you would have Walter Cronkite literally doing the play-by-play.
Right.
And I remember the moment.
There was none better than Walter.
Man, but I actually remember the actual moment, standing in front of the mechanical board. There's no CGI. There's no special effects. They have a giant mechanical board set up in the TV room, and they are literally, somebody is behind it, literally moving the little, it's like Star Trek, Star Trek special effects. They're literally moving the Apollo, lander through the display, and I remember the very moment Walter Cronkite looked at America, looked dead into the camera, and just said, they're entering the dark side of the moon. And, it's just that moment, and he goes, and there will be silence. And at that moment, the TV kind of backs up, and literally, you got to see the control room, you got to see all the stuff, and you got to see Walter, and everybody just stood there.
Yeah, in hope.
Because it had now disappeared. For the first time ever, we had a spacecraft and Americans gone.
What was that like?
We have no idea what just happened to them.
I mean, that had to have been nerve-wracking. Like,
America couldn't breathe.
Right.
Well, it was, and I remember that just before we lost signal, and they did go around the backside of the moon, the flight controller that we were plugged in with on our line of communication in the main control room, and he said, "Are we all go?" And we said yes, and I remember him saying, "God, I hope so."
Oh, okay.
Yeah. In other words, I hope we. I hope.
It's a vote of confidence.
Yeah.
But,
Yep.
you know,
And as it turned out, it turned out just
Fine.
completely
all of America
successfully.
was literally sitting on the edge of their seat.
Yeah.
You know, at the end of that little trip, and we're expecting them to return to, and I mean literally, they're all standing around like that. You know, of course, giant 1960s technology speaker.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you hear that little beep, and then then you got to hear the Houston, it's like it just the room erupts in cheers, and I just literally remember all of us sitting around the little TV.
Well, goodness, if you're describing how America was, what did you think it was like in the control center?
Steel anatomy, okay?
I'm just having the flashback from my experience. I can't even begin to compare that
Alan, you're
to how
talking
you
about
guys.
the astronauts going to the bathroom in their suit. I mean, there you go.
These guys needed it.
I mean, what do? Do you take a restroom break? Do you,
Well, that's some of us did, because there was nothing you could do.
Yeah.
Can you imagine the number of people that ran outside of that building for the next 15 minutes to smoke?
At that
Well,
I was gonna say back.
regarding smoking, we didn't have to leave the building.
You had ashtrays right there on your
Now,
Jeremy. Go ahead.
let me tell you a story about what's occurring in the Space Center in Houston now. They are restoring that famous control center, and it will be open for visitors and tourists, probably in conjunction with the 50th anniversary of the successful lunar landing Apollo 11. Next July, they'll have a ribbon cutting ceremony, and they're going to make a big deal out of this. But I was talking to one of the historians on the phone not too long ago, within the past month, and I said, well, you'll have all the old operations plans there, and the objectives and checklists, everything but the cigarettes. And she said, no, we'll have the cigarettes there too. There are smokers who are saving their cigarette butts to fill up the ashtrays, and the ashtrays will be filled with used dead cigarette butts for the display.
The handprints where the sweaty palms are still there too. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Jeremy, we didn't even get into Apollo 13, but I think we've teased this pretty well, but tell us what's going to happen next week at your meeting, because this is not your typical Memphis Astronomical Society meeting.
Correct. November the 2nd, Friday. That's the Friday after Halloween is going to be this meeting. You're going to hear the full version of this presentation. So we're giving the entire night to Bill Weppner. It's going to be at Christian Brothers University, and it's going to be in the Spain Auditorium, not Assessi Hall where we normally meet.
Wait, where is that?
So Spain Auditorium is Buckman 106. So all you got to do is find Buckman Hall and go downstairs, and that's where Spain Auditorium is. It seats 150 people. It's got a stage. It's got a projector. We're hiring a sound person for this also. Yeah. So this is going to be a full-fledged MAS production, and we're giving the evening to Bill Weppner. And he's doing both parts. He's got a full presentation, including video, clips, and I will send out a detailed instructional video briefly of how to get to Spain Auditorium, and we will have signs outside of Assessi Hall directing people. But bottom line is this: if you go to Assessi Hall where we normally meet, hang a left and go straight, and you would literally dead end into Spain Auditorium. You'll walk through the tunnel there, past the post office, and then you'll see Buckman Hall, and you just go downstairs, and that's where Spain Auditorium is, Buckman Hall 106.
Okay.
Meeting starts at 8 o'clock p.m.
Right?
You park in the same spot.
Okay.
So 8 o'clock p.m., Spain Auditorium, Buckman 106, Friday, November the 2nd. Our website is memphisastro.org, and that's it. I mean, This is our meeting.
I would recommend if anybody's interested in this stuff, they should sign up for your email because you guys aren't obnoxious about it. I get regular updates, but they're not the annoying you guys send actual information that I care about. So how do people sign up if they want to get on the email list? So.
Yeah, our website again is memphisastro.org. You can also send an email to Memphis Astronomical Society at gmail.com. That's our general email address, and then I will add you to our email list.
Yeah, because Bill, we have many questions, but we can't, we'd have you on here all day. But man, I can't wait for this presentation. We're looking forward to this. And we're probably going to recruit you for more, be prepared for some.
I would love it. That's what I'm here for. Thank you for the opportunity to reminisce a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. It was great having you on.
Again, if you have young, it's for everybody. Young, old, it's free and open to the general public, but this is a great opportunity if you have young children who are interested in science and space to get them out next Friday, November the 2nd.
Okay, cool. All right, guys. Well, I don't know how you top that, but we're going to... We're going to continue the discussion. Thanks a lot, Bill. And when we come back next, though, we're going to talk about Marvel's Netflix implosion. Is that right?
No.
Okay.
But it's okay.
We're going to talk about Netflix and Marvel.
Geek Tank Radio, energized by
Dark Oak Press and Media, an indie publisher and media provider offering everything from Alice in Memphis to mystery to young adult and everything in between. Get the latest at darkoakpress.com.
More below and on 1019kissfm.com. Keyword Geek Tank.